Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Game of Thrones book-to-show comparison for Season 4. This video is part of a series of videos where I compare the show to the books to state the top 5 things I felt the show did better than the books, and my top 5 things I felt the books did better than the show. This video is for Season 4, so spoiler warning up to Season 4 of the show. And I also gave a mild spoiler warning if you haven't read any of the books, even though the show is pretty much caught up to the books. If you're really sensitive about spoilers, I do talk vaguely about one event that has yet to occur in the show that still may occur. So, Season 4 was a unique season for me personally, as it marked the first season that I watched where I was aware of what occurred in the books before I watched the show. As when I watched the first 3 seasons, I had absolutely no idea what occurred in the books or what might happen in the show. However, during the hiatus between Season 3 and 4, I grew very antsy and decided unwisely to read the Wikipedia page for A Storm of Swords, which gave away all the main plot points in that book and thus the stuff that would likely occur in the upcoming Season 4. So when the big events like Joffrey's death happened in the show, I wasn't at all surprised, and to be honest, this kind of ruined it for me. So at this stage, since I knew what was going to happen anyway, I decided I might as well read the books. So I started reading the books while Season 4 was airing. I finished reading A Storm of Swords just days before the season finale of Season 4 aired. So when I first saw that episode, most of the events depicted in it were still fresh in my mind as I just read that part of the books. Although there were a few scenes from A Dance with Dragons, like Bran's encounter with the Children of the Forest and Daenerys locking up her dragons, that I hadn't gotten to yet. In any case, this means my take on Season 4 was slightly different than other seasons, so it may affect what I think of the books, what the books did better than the show, and vice versa, but I'll give it a go. So I'll start off with my top 5 things I personally felt the show did better than the books in Season 4. These are cases where I felt the show managed to improve upon the source material. Starting with my number 5, Bran's encounter with the freaky skeletons. I know this one is going to be a controversial choice that many will disagree with, as I've seen many express the opposite opinion that they felt the scene was poorly adapted from the books, but I personally strongly disagree, and I'm not going to pretend that I don't just because this opinion isn't popular. I loved this scene, and I felt this one was the best scenes of Season 4. Personally, I felt this was much scarier and much freakier than it was in the books. This was one of the most intense scenes in the entire show, and it finally made Bran's storyline really interesting. At the time, the use of more skeleton-looking whites was questioned. However, the 5th season episode, Hardhome, illustrated that these skeletons were just another form of white, as whites will have different appearances based on how long dead bodies have decayed. And of course, the stakes were raised by actually having them kill Jojen, which frankly wasn't a character that was vital to the show, and I thought the foreshadowing of his death was really nicely done. I also loved that we finally got to see one of the Children of the Forest who was thought to be extinct, and how she just popped up out of nowhere and saved Bran's life. It was really exciting. And I know some people complained about her throwing fireballs, but I didn't care. I loved it. I even heard those who hadn't read the books complain that they thought her throwing fireballs was far too fantasy for Game of Thrones, and I'm sorry to be blunt, but I personally find those complaints fucking ridiculous. I mean, we're talking about a show where a witch gave birth to a smoke monster that killed someone, where dragons were magically born in a fire in which a woman survived unburnt, where a man is brought back to life through the use of magic after being killed 6 times, and there's an army of strange creatures that have the power to raise the dead and form an army of ice zombies that's coming to kill everyone. But no, all that's fine, but a girl throwing fireballs, oh, that's just way too fantasy. Give us a fucking break. I'm sorry, but that argument has absolutely, positively no leg to stand on. I love the fireball throwings, and I hope to see more of it. Number 4 is the battle at the wall. So in the books, this was actually broken up into two smaller battles. For one of them, Jon Snow is just perched on a tower somewhere shooting arrows the whole time. And you really only see things through his perspective, and so it's very limiting. In the book, Samwell Tarly and Alliser Thorne haven't even returned to the Wall at this point. So they had no involvement in either battle. You don't actually see Ygritte get the fatal wound. After the battle, Jon finds her dying with an arrow to the chest. He has no idea who shot her, but by the type of arrow, he can tell that it wasn't him. Whereas the show does a much better job of making this a huge spectacle. Like the Battle of Blackwater, we get a lot more viewpoint characters here and see a lot more of the action going on. They added the biggest fire the North has ever seen moment, which was awesome. Jon's epic fight with Magnar of Thenn, Alliser Thorne kicking ass, Sam pledging to make it back to Gilly alive, Ghost being there and biting people. Just overall, it was a much bigger deal and much more epic. Number 3 is Shay's storyline. Here's another point where I feel I may get a lot of disagreement because I heard a lot of complaints about this, but personally I love how the show handled Shay's storyline, and I think a lot of the complaints stem from people getting the material in the show mixed up with the material in the books, as I think the show set up a very clear and effective Shakespearean type tragedy narrative where Tyrion lies to Shay in order to protect her, where he tells her he doesn't love her and she's just a whore in order to get her to leave the city so he can save her life. But it ends up backfiring on him in the worst possible way, as it leads to her resenting him, and so her father sleeps with her and uses her to testify against him, and it inevitably leads him to having to kill her in order to defend himself. A truly effective tragedy, which was quite different from what occurred in the books, where Shay was never in love with Tyrion in the first place and was just using him to her advantage. So when he was no longer in a position to support her, she switched to someone who could, namely his father, and so he killed her because she meant nothing to him. This made Tyrion in the books far more idiotic, as it was obvious she didn't love him and was just using him, and he was a fool to ever think otherwise. And so I felt what the show did was far more powerful, far more effective. In fact, I made a whole 30-minute video called Why Shay's Storyline Was Awesome, where I explained just how great this storyline was and cleared up many of the misconceptions people had about the storyline by getting it confused with the books. And also included was an explanation on why the mention of Tysha was left out of the show, and why it worked so much better for the show by not having the catalyst for Tyrion killing his father being Tysha and switching that to Shay, which was a very smart decision on the showrunner's part. Anyway, I'll leave a link in the description below for that video if you want to hear me go into more detail about this topic. Number 2 is Sansa's turn to the dark side. Now, I heard a lot, many people complain about this because Peter Baelish came off as more incompetent than he did in the books. But I really liked the dynamic that Sansa had to out Littlefinger in order to save his life. This was a huge leap in bounds for Sansa's character development, which I felt was absolutely vital for her character at this stage in the show, and took precedent over making sure Littlefinger was always the mastermind and never got anything wrong. Besides, I don't think it's too far-fetched to suppose he was caught off guard by Lysa trying to kill Sansa and just reacted by killing her without having a fully developed plan to get out of it. As I said, this was vital for Sansa, particularly in the show where many fans had it up to here with her being a weak and a naive character who was constantly being abused and shoved around, and where it got to the point where she was actually one of the show's least popular characters. So it was important to see her character growth, where she finally learned from Cersei, Littlefinger, Tyrion, and Marjorie that it was all about playing the game and manipulating people to get what you want. And that moment where she starts doing this made her infinitely more interesting as a character. It was just so awesome the way she played those Vale Lords and just gave Littlefinger that look. Such a great moment in the series. Whereas in the book, she remains a kind of weak figure that Littlefinger still pushes around. And my number one thing I felt the show did better than the books in Season 4 is Tyrion's Trial. That trial scene where Tyrion tells off everyone in King's Landing was like, "I should have killed you all," and then demands a trial by combat was one of the best moments in the series and was certainly the best performance. Dinklage was absolutely robbed of an Emmy for this performance. Now, he did give a similar speech in the books. However, this scene was much more dramatic and powerful the way it was unfolded in the show. As in the books, the possibility of a trial by combat was already explored. Oberyn had already offered to be Tyrion's champion, and Cersei had already selected the Mountain to be her champion. And so it wasn't such a shock for Tyrion to choose a trial by combat, as that option had already been explored and discussed. Plus, it was just way more dramatic the way Tyrion just spat, out at Tywin, because Tywin thought he was going to win by forcing Jaime into a deal where he had to, be the heir of Castle Rock again, and Tyrion just ruined everything with those 3 words. And to see that look of defiance on his face where he just stared at Tywin and was just like, "Fuck you," and Tywin was fucking pissed. It was such a well-performed scene all around. It was simply amazing, making it my number one thing I felt the show did better than the books in Season 4. So now I'll get to my top 5 things I felt the books did better than the show in Season 4. So these are examples where I felt the show failed to adapt the source material properly. So we'll start with my number 5, which is Tyrion going to Tywin's bedroom wasn't very clear in the show. I stand by what I said about how I felt Shay's overall story arc worked better in the show, as well as the show's decision to exclude the Tysha storyline from this moment. However, the one drawback to that is that it wasn't made very clear why Tyrion had suddenly decided to go to Tywin's bedroom. In fact, it wasn't even made very clear that he was indeed going to Tywin's bedroom, as I talked to several casual show watchers that didn't even pick up on the fact that it was Tywin's bedroom, and that the implication was that Tywin was sleeping with Shay. In the book, it was made clear not only that he was going to Tywin's bedchamber, but why. As Jaime had revealed that everything Tywin had told him about his first wife, Tysha, was a lie, so Tyrion in anger went to confront him, whereas in the show, Tyrion didn't have that motivation. I suppose we're meant to assume that Tyrion went to confront Tywin about why he had sentenced him to death, but I really don't see why he needed to do that. And overall, it just wasn't made very clear in the show. I think they could have done a better job of explaining this. Number 4 is Stannis' battle with the wildlings. Don't get me wrong, I love the overhead helicopter shots of Stannis' cavalry surrounding the wildlings on both sides. I thought that was awesome, but I felt the battle ended far too quickly as compared to the books. In the show, Stannis just charged in and wiped everyone out, and it just took like a matter of seconds, whereas in the books, it was an actual battle. Sure, it was still a bit one-sided where Stannis had the clear advantage, but it was still more of an actual battle. And the main thing I felt was missing was in the books, Melisandre was there. And she lit this warg's bird on fire, and there was this huge explosion with this bird burning in the sky, and the warg who was in the bird started screaming and freaking out. Sure, this wasn't essential to the story, but I thought this was a really cool moment, and overall the battle was just far more dramatic and effective in the books than it was in the show. Also, this battle should have been at the end of episode 9, not at the start of episode 10. I felt that was a very poor decision to place it there, as episode 9 felt incomplete, and seeing it at the start of episode 10 where you had to get back into it kind of felt like, if they had ended episode 8 in the middle of the Mountain Viper fight and then showed the conclusion where the mountain was crushing Oberyn's head at the start of the next episode. Wouldn't be quite as effective, would it? And I felt the same thing applied here. Number 3 is, where the frickin' Ironborn? Now, some of you may be thinking this complaint would be more appropriate for Season 5 because that's when we're supposed to get things like the Kingsmoot storyline that the show admitted. And we did see some of the Ironborn this season, but not much of them. Tywin mentioned that they were still attacking the north, but when we saw them at Moat Cailin, they were all sick and dying and easy to defeat. And overall, the Ironborn didn't seem to be a threat at all. Although it was this way in the books too, there was a specific reason given for this in the books that didn't apply in the show. Therefore, in the show, the Ironborn just came off as weak and incompetent, whereas in the books, they're portrayed as a strong, effective warriors. I'm still hoping that Season 6 will correct this portrayal of them, but even if it does, it won't change the fact that they were portrayed very poorly in this season. Also, there was the debacle with Yara's elite team of Ironborns being defeated by shirtless Ramsay and a bunch of dogs. And then there's a certain someone who is still alive that shouldn't be. Overall, I was very disappointed with the portrayal of the Ironborn this season. Number 2 is travel times make no frickin' sense. Now, this has always been a problem with the show, as characters always seem to travel to distant places much faster than they should, most notably in Season 3, where Melisandre went from Dragonstone to the middle of the Riverlands and then back to Dragonstone in the span of a few episodes. But this season saw Littlefinger, who left for the Eyrie back in Season 3, who had assumed was at the Eyrie, go from the Eyrie back to King's Landing and then back to the Eyrie by mid-season. It's actually a very long trip up rugged mountains from the Vale coastline to the Eyrie, and then a decent boat ride from the Vale to King's Landing. Yet Littlefinger shows quite the speed accomplishing this. What's worse is the character of Locke, who was last seen in episode 7 of Season 3 in Harrenhal, who we assume is still there up until the end of Season 3. During that time, he traveled all the way from Harrenhal up to the Dreadfort, where Roose noted they had to smuggle themselves back into the north since the Ironborn still held Moat Cailin, and to go all the way into Dreadfort by episode 2. And then, by episode 2, he went all the way from the Dreadfort to Castle Black by episode 4. And then, in the very next episode, traveled all the way up to Craster's Keep, which is quite a distance north of the Wall. Meaning, from the end of Season 3 to episode 5 of Season 4, Locke traveled all the way from Harrenhal to Craster's Keep, which is an insane distance. Now, traveling fast like this can be explained away by the show speeding through time frames a bit quicker. They could say, well, it's possible several months could pass in between episodes, and that would be a fair explanation. It would be if it wasn't for the fact there is an example of other journeys that take far longer than they should. In contrast to Locke's journey, you got Arya and the Hound, who start their journey from the Twins to the Eyrie in episode 9 of Season 3, and they don't even get to the freaking Bloody Gate until episode 8 of Season 4. And it's not even that freaking long of a journey. Look at it! There's no freaking reason it should take them that freaking long. And mind you, they were traveling by horse. They weren't even freaking walking. Also, if you look at the map, if they took the main road, they should have dropped by the crossroads so Arya could say hi to Hot Pie, which didn't happen. Now, one could argue that they didn't take the main road and went off-road through the mountains, which is why it took them longer. But Arya and the Hound are clearly still in the Riverlands by episode 7 and didn't get to the mountains of the Vale until episode 8, so clearly they traveled along the Riverlands and the Flatlands. By doing so, there's no freaking reason it should have taken them so long. In other words, it took Arya and the Hound much longer to get this measly distance from the Twins to the Bloody Gate than it did for Locke to go all the way from Harrenhal to Craster's Keep, which he did much quicker. So there's several explanations for this. Either Locke and Littlefinger have a magical transporter no one else knows about, or Arya and the Hound were trapped in a weird time warp where time moves at a much slower rate. Personally, I'm going with the time warp theory. Now, you may think that's just a minor gripe, but I think it's a huge deal. I've learned to switch the logic part of my brain off when dealing with travel times in the show, and that's really not a good thing and a big flaw. And my number one thing I felt the books did better than the show in Season 4 is Arya's storyline. So, speaking of Arya and the Hound, in the book A Storm of Swords, Arya spends a lot more time with the Brotherhood without banners. They get into a lot more adventures than they do in the show, and then the Red Wedding happens about 3/4 of the way through the book, and Arya has a couple more chapters where she's traveling with the Hound, where they come across a group of Lannister men at a tavern, where the Hound engages them in a fight where he gets mortally wounded, and then Arya promptly leaves him for dead without mercy killing him. Now, the way this played out in the books works really well and makes perfect sense. It's nice and succinct and doesn't drag out for too long. Whereas in the show, the Red Wedding happens at the end of Season 3. Arya spends all of Season 4 with the Hound traveling through the Riverlands. A journey, as I just explained above, took far longer than it should have. Not only this, it was filled with a lot of boring, repetitive, and unnecessary filler that was just there to give Arya and the Hound more screen time and added absolutely nothing to the story. The moment in episode 1 where Arya and the Hound got into a fight with the Lannister men at the tavern was awesome. However, everything that happened after that, up until Arya got on the boat to Braavos, was a complete waste of time. Also, the show decided to add in the completely unnecessary fight between Brienne and the Hound, which was just giant fan service that reminded me of like when we were kids and we were talking about how cool it would be for Luke Skywalker to fight Captain Kirk. It added nothing to the story and was promptly erased in the next season from everyone's memory like it never happened. The only lasting consequence was that the Hound was mortally wounded, which could have been easily accomplished another way, such as the price he had on his head, which was a plot line that didn't pay off. More than that, because the show spent all season long establishing a mentor relationship between Arya and the Hound, where it got to the point where the Hound told Brienne he was looking after her, it totally ruined the subsequent scene where Arya left the Hound for dead without mercy killing him. A scene that had made perfect sense in the books no longer made sense in the show because the show established a different relationship between these characters, but then promptly ignored what it had just established to repeat a plot point from the books that no longer made sense in this new dynamic that the show had established. The whole thing was very sloppy writing that just didn't work at all, and all that boring and pointless filler about the Hound messing around with the farmer who just wanted protection, and these dumbass assassins that suck at killing people, and then messing up plot points that worked in the books by attempting to give the fan base an unnecessary handjob made Arya's storyline the number one thing the books did better than the show in Season 4. So that's it for my Game of Thrones book to show comparison for Season 4. Be sure to check out my channel for many other Game of Thrones videos, and be sure to subscribe to keep up with all the other Game of Thrones videos I plan on doing in the future. And thanks a lot for watching.